Hi, welcome everyone. Today we have Orla with us, who's going to be telling us all about gluten-free, celiac, any questions you might have. We already have about 20 questions that Orla will be answering, including things like do I need to be gluten-free if I'm not allergic to gluten? Or things like, what does it feel like if I eat gluten and I'm celiac and I don't know if I'm celiac? Or things like, how did someone live their whole life not even knowing they're celiac, and then boom, it just happened and they figured it out towards the end? So watch us today. If you have more questions for Orla or for myself, you can send them to us on YouTube, and we will answer your questions as and when we receive them. Even if we don't know the answer, we will direct you in the right way. Please don't ask hard questions because we've already prepared for the live. We don't want to be grilled on the spot. But do bring all your questions on board. Orla, welcome today. Please introduce
Thank
yourself
you.
to our viewers.
Hello, everybody. My name is Orla McDeid, and I am a public health nutritionist who also so happens to have celiac disease.
Perfect combination.
Indeed, indeed. And it does help now, I must say, it does help in terms of managing it.
Definitely, definitely. We already have 5 viewers online, so we're not going to keep people waiting. We'll get started. Our first question, can you see the questions on the screen?
Yes, I can indeed.
Amazing. So our first question is, can you give us a brief introduction about gluten?
Yes, so basically what gluten is a collection of proteins that is found in cereal grains. So the main cereal grains where gluten is present in would be wheat, rye and barley.
Mm-hmm.
And gluten's main role within those type of products is providing elasticity and bounce. So it's sort of what creates the bounce when you squeeze bread. In terms of gluten and the proteins, the two biggest proteins you would see would be gliadin and glutenin. So they would be the most common
Okay.
family of proteins.
So there are two
But
different
basic,
types.
yeah, that would be the two
Okay.
biggest types. But essentially what it is a protein that is found in grains.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And question on celiac disease. So, what is the background of celiac disease or condition? We had this question a few times and we asked disease or
Mhm.
condition because, as someone with celiac, do you prefer for people to call it celiac disease by the book, or do you prefer if people call it celiac condition, but that maybe dilutes the importance of it a little bit and people wouldn't take it as serious?
Yes, I think you make a really good point there, Jolie, actually. Personally, I prefer celiac disease. It is called a few different things. So some people say it is a form of gluten intolerance, some people call it an illness, and some people call it a disease. I personally
Mm.
prefer to call it a disease because it is actually an autoimmune disease. So it is one of the many family of autoimmune diseases out there. And basically, what it is when the body ingests gluten, an immune response is mediated in the body, and basically, the own body attacks its own tissues and organs. So, in the case
Mm.
of celiac disease, it's the gut that takes the main damage, but it is a
Mm.
multi systemic disorder. So it actually affects other organs in the body as well. So basically, it's an autoimmune disease, and the body essentially attacks itself. It views gluten as this horrible invader that's going to cause so much damage, and then it sort of initiates this response where the body then has a complete inflammatory overreaction to it. So it's an autoimmune disease.
And from what I've seen, like serving customers in Yummzy as a cafe, we get customers who would say they would know straight away if the cupcakes had gluten. And we had customers who would just say, guys, we trust you because we didn't even know we were celiac until we had other like issues, long-term issues that came up. So you really know that there is no gluten here. And I was saying we check our ingredients, we check that nobody, even a customer, doesn't walk in with gluten bread or cakes or anything into the shop. We check that there is absolutely no gluten in the air, no gluten in the ingredients, no gluten anywhere. So, is it different from one person to the other, that inflammatory reaction?
So yes, there is basically anyone that eats gluten who has celiac disease is causing internal damage. But in
Hmm.
terms of the reaction and the symptoms, it differs from person to person. So you do tend to get more sensitive celiac disease patients over the other. However, the one sort of recurring theme is that it is still all causing the same damage inside, dependent
Yes.
on the external symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course. I guess for me as a type 1 diabetic, I kind of realize the damage because even if as a kid who wasn't keen on insulin and all of this, I ate a cupcake, I might not feel bad now, but I definitely
Mhm.
saw the effects of that cupcake in a few days time or a few years time, where I don't know, my eyes would not be good, or I would feel
Yes.
lethargic, or this or that.
Mhm.
So I can definitely
Yeah.
see what you mean.
Yes. Or you
Okay.
would maybe get the brain fog or something like that, which can be another
Exactly.
autoimmune disease reaction that isn't necessarily instantaneous, but can happen a wee bit later on. So it's different from person to person, really.
Amazing, thanks for the explanation. So how would you say the UK compares with other countries in terms of diagnosing celiac disease and our knowledge in general? This is a perfect question, especially for someone with your background and your professional expertise.
Yeah. Well, that's a fabulous question. Um, where I would see the UK comparing with other countries is I would say the UK is probably in the top five, but I would probably say they would not be the top. So there's
Okay.
kind of two ways I can answer this. I can say what the UK is doing well and what they're doing right, and then I can also say where other countries are perhaps probably slightly ahead of the game. So in the UK, they're one of a number of countries where we have legislation in place that protects people with celiac disease. So that would be
Mhm.
things like food allergy legislation and those kind of things. And the other thing I would say is the UK is one of very few countries that allows celiacs to obtain gluten-free products on prescription.
No way.
So yes, so for the most part,
Really?
now there's
So
some
if someone is celiac, they can actually buy celiac bread on subscription.
Yes, so most
Prescription.
parts in the UK,
Wow.
some trusts in England now have stopped doing it because of price concerns, but certainly in Northern
Yeah.
Ireland, some parts of Scotland, Wales, and some parts of England, you actually get a prescription like any other disease that someone is diagnosed with and needs
Wow.
medication. They receive the gluten-free products because that is our medication.
That's
So,
amazing. That's
yeah,
like a
so that
diabetic receiving low carb products. That's amazing.
yes, yes,
Wow, maybe one day
exactly.
this
Yeah.
will be the case.
I really hope so. Because at the moment you're just getting your insulin, which of
Yeah.
course you need to survive. Um, but no, I think that's where the UK is doing quite well. And certainly in terms of Ireland as well, you can claim certain gluten-free products back on universal credit.
Hmm.
Where I feel the UK falls down on is particularly in terms of catering and eating out. So I feel that more sort of more knowledge is needed in terms of cross contamination. So I
Hmm.
feel that every restaurant in the UK, by law, should have separate fryers for people who are gluten free and people who are not. And that is not enshrined in law at the moment, but that is just up to the restaurant. And the other thing I would say is, I'm not sure if you heard of this, but the Food Safety Authority just released guidelines where now any pre-packed food items have to state the ingredients and the allergens, where previously they didn't. Um,
Really
yeah,
amazing. That's
so
good.
yes. So that's really positive. Where I feel other countries are better than the UK is Australia and New Zealand. They are pretty much top of the list for allergy legislation.
In what
They
sense?
are
What do they do better?
very, very strict. So when it comes to gluten-free labeling, an example would be gluten-free oats. They do not have any gluten-free oats on the market because there is a disparity between gluten-free oats where some celiacs can tolerate it and some can't. And so Australia are really, really careful of that and just do not have those products available. So they would
Right.
sort of be top of the list for that. The other country I would say, which is probably doing a lot better on the research front, is Finland. They are probably have the leading research facility there,
Yeah.
and they have a very high percentage of celiacs. So whilst I think the UK are doing well in terms of some aspects, particularly this new guideline coming out known as Natasha's Law, I think that probably more is needed in terms of educating medical practitioners, because the average length of time for someone to be diagnosed in the UK is 13 years, which is crazy.
13 years, the amount of damage
Yes,
that can happen in that time.
yes. So clearly
Wow.
that stat shows to me that we could do better. So I feel like the UK is probably in the top 5, but I feel that Australia and New Zealand, perhaps Finland and Ireland, are certainly better in other aspects.
I don't actually know if I'm celiac or not, because I could never get tested because I was asked to take gluten to be able to have the test. And my feedback was, guys, I'm doing low carb. I haven't touched gluten in like 10 years. I'm not gonna start doing it now. So no, thank you. But
Yeah.
I mean, I always proactively avoid anything with gluten and yeast and carbs because I react badly to yeast as well. And the worst thing is when I go to a restaurant and I'm simply asking, like, can I have this option gluten free? Like, even if it's a salad, can you please not add any croutons? And then they just bring you the croutons and they're like, yeah, you can push it to the side or you can do this. And I'm thinking,
I've
thank
been
God
in
I
that
don't know if I'm
situation.
celiac.
Yeah, I've had many Caesar salads served to me with the croutons, despite me asking not. Yeah, I've been there. I feel
And they're
you.
like, yeah, just push it to the side. And you're like, really? Well, in my case,
Oh,
thank God, I don't even know if I'm celiac or not.
oh gosh, it doesn't really work like that for celiacs, does it?
No. My cousin is. And for her, she would just tell the restaurant, you know what? I don't want to eat anything. Take the whole salad.
Yeah, it can create so much anxiety. It really can.
It does, it does. And I think a lot of people don't understand, like a lot of people in the industry, even staff we had, when we would tell them, like, please don't bring sandwiches into the shop and so on, they'd be like, but why? I want to bring my sandwich. And I say to them, bring your sandwich, just eat it outside the shop. Don't bring it in the shop because we have celiac people's lives in our hands and we can't risk any kind of contamination. And they would be like, yeah, but if I'm eating it outside the kitchen, and I'm like, no, just eat it totally outside the shop, wash your hand 15 times, then come to the kitchen, and then we can talk.
Oh
But
my
yeah,
God.
not a lot of people, and these people have worked as chefs in other places, so it's almost shocking how they just thought, oh, but I can eat my sandwich, no problem. You never know how that piece of bread will fly somewhere or do something. No, you can't.
Yeah, no, it certainly can be an issue. It really can. And more knowledge and awareness, I definitely agree with you, is needed on that front.
Yeah, I'd rather be safe than sorry every time.
Yeah.
So yeah. Next question is,
Mhm.
can you suddenly become celiac or are you born celiac?
So the answer in short to that is yes, you can suddenly become celiac at any stage of the life cycle. So there are two stages of the life cycle where you are more commonly diagnosed with celiac disease, and that is children under 10 and adults over 40. So that would
Oh,
be the
wow.
two age groups where you would most commonly get diagnosed with it. However, it doesn't discriminate against age. Anyone can develop the disease at any time. You can be genetically predisposed to it, so it's only a matter of time. So if a first
Mm.
degree relative has it, you've got a 1 in 10 chance of developing it yourself. But yes, there's many different reasons why someone can suddenly become a celiac. And the big ones would be pregnancy and childbirth, a bout of really severe stress. If
Mm.
someone has a really serious bout of gastroenteritis followed by antibiotic treatment, or gastrosurgery to do with the gastrointestinal system. And what they
Right.
all have in common is all those different things involve severe stress on the gut microbiome, which triggers an immune response, which can then trigger celiac disease. So yes, you can suddenly become a celiac. That's not me saying, though, a bit of a disclaimer, that if you're incredibly stressed, you're going to get celiac disease. Or if you've had
Mm-mm.
food poisoning, you're going to get it. It's just that that can increase the risk. And if you're
Yeah.
already genetically predisposed to it, then it's just going to add to that. But yeah, you can suddenly get celiac disease. And we're seeing more and more people, even in their 60s, who are being diagnosed with it and have
Yeah.
gone their whole life not having it, being able to tolerate gluten, and all of a sudden, just like that, they have it.
Yeah. In many cases as well, from customers that we spoke to, we realized, and even family members, we realized many people don't even know they have it. They eat gluten, they
Mm-hmm.
eat everything as usual, but then when they get older, in the frailer side of like getting old and so on, they realize things like, oh, no matter what I do, my iron just never moves. It's always too
Mm-hmm.
low. Or things
Yeah.
like a person dies because of a bursted colon, like
Yes.
they had colon cancer or a bursted colon or something like that. And then the doctors afterwards, they're like, oh, they must have been celiac and they never knew about it. And you're
Yes.
thinking, how did someone not even know they were celiac? But
Yeah.
for many
Yeah.
people, it's masked. They don't even know they have it until a later
Yeah.
stage.
I
And for
think you
some
make a
people, it's
really good point.
even, but yeah, some people, for them, it's even like just a strange pain, or as you said, brain fog, or they think it's a
Mhm.
carb coma, or any of these things, but they don't realize it's related to that.
Yes, yes, that's a really good point. So you can kind of summarize it in those two sections where someone does suddenly develop it because of this severe gut microbiome
Mm-hmm.
displacement, or someone who has gone years who is a celiac, but it's latent and they're either putting down the symptoms to something else, ignoring them, or which is now the case with a lot of celiac disease cases. We call it aclassical. So it means that it's not the digestive symptoms, it's all the other symptoms, like the brain fog, like the irregular heartbeat, like the tooth enamel and ulcer problems,
Mm.
infertility, issues with periods. And they're all the symptoms that people don't associate with celiac disease, but actually now are becoming far more common.
Yeah.
So there's not enough awareness around that. And so not enough people are going to get the test and have it their whole life. And then, as you said, when old age kicks in, you become frailer. And actually, what happens with your gut microbiome as you get older is it becomes more pro inflammatory and you lose your good bacteria. Then a lot of those things are going to start to show. So, yeah, it can be twofold. You can suddenly develop it just like that and you'll know straight away. Or it is latent, it's underlying, and you just do not know that you have it.
And it stays masked
Mm-hmm.
until later. Amazing. Next question: can you grow out of celiac disease?
No, you definitely can't.
Oh.
Once you're diagnosed with celiac disease, because it is a lifelong autoimmune illness, you will have it for life. You know, it's the same with type 1 diabetes because your pancreas just does not make insulin. You have to give yourself the insulin.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. You can't grow out of it. It's autoimmune and it's just something that you have to positively manage for the rest of your life.
Okay. Okay. And how did you know that you were celiac?
Oh, joyous memories.
How old were you? How did you know?
Oh, my word. My
This is a very
story.
precious question for someone with diabetes. Is it the same for you?
Oh gosh, I mean, it does bring back fairly traumatic memories. I'm not going to lie, but I think it's
Sorry.
really important that I do share this story so people can understand and learn from it themselves.
Yeah.
So I was diagnosed when I was 23 years old, and I first developed symptoms when I was 21. So I am the case of a typical classical celiac diagnosis where out of nowhere, incredibly suddenly, I became very, very ill. I lost a lot of weight, about 3 stone. I
Mm.
was chronically tired. I had severe diarrhea, abdominal distension, I had flatulence, and I was having chronic throat infections and mouth ulcers.
Mm.
Um, Me being me, I was in the middle of my placement year at university. So I was really struggling on my placement year initially, and I put all these symptoms down to stress. And that's what I thought it was. So I just said to myself, you're really stressed, you're in a job that you're struggling with. Once you feel less stress, it will resolve. In
Mm.
fact, even when I began to settle into the job, the symptoms didn't subside at all. So what happened was I went to my GP, and it was actually decided that I was to get a tonsillectomy, so get my tonsils removed, because I was having
Mm.
constant throat infections. So I had my tonsils removed, and I was still ill. So from there, I eventually went back to my GP and said, I'm actually a little bit worried about this. At the same time, I was back at university and we were studying celiac disease. And I went, hold
Ah.
on a minute, those symptoms, my symptoms. And it was like this epiphany, this light bulb moment where I realized I might have celiac disease. So then I got my blood test done, and it all led from there. So yes, I had very classical, typical symptoms that I ignored, that I put down to stress, that I should not have, and that I
Mm.
should have sought advice sooner. So I wish I did, but hey presto, I now have my diagnosis.
But as we were discussing, people don't realize it is this, and for
Yeah.
some people it can be so mild. For a friend of
Mm-hmm.
ours, she didn't even know she had celiac. She was just constantly having pain in her lower back, and they just put
Oh.
it down to her spine or something is wrong with her spine. And she did all the MRI scans and everything, and then they realized, actually your spine is fine. We don't realize what's going on. And she was like, "Oh, my bones hurt, everything hurts. I'm tired and this and that."
Mm-hmm.
And she put it down to stress, as you said. And
Yeah.
it was really smart. She was in Italy, and the doctor there was saying, like, let's do a blood check on everything. And that's when he realized certain, I think her iron or something like that was extremely low, or her vitamin B or something like that. And then he realized she's taking supplements for this, but it's still low. Something is wrong. And that's when they were like, let's test if you're celiac or not. And that's when they were like, ah, okay, you can't have gluten. Whether celiac or not, you can't have gluten. End of story for her. So so yeah, for some people it's not that obvious to
Yes.
identify.
Very much so. They call it the iceberg. They call it the celiac iceberg. So if you think about it, it's a bit like the Titanic. So the top of the iceberg that's just visible are the very obvious symptoms that I had, like the
Right.
diarrhea, yes, the abdominal distension, the flatulence. But most of the iceberg sits below the surface. And that is all those symptoms that you talked about, the latent symptoms that people tend to not
Mm.
necessarily associate, like the tiredness, like the brain fog, the joint problems. So that's why I like to sort of liken it to the celiac iceberg, above the
Mm.
surface, and then the huge symptoms below the
Hidden
surface.
parts. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And you don't see them as easy as you see the top of the iceberg.
Yeah.
So, right. I am not celiac. Actually, this question was also for me. I am not celiac, but I was told I need to eat gluten to be tested, but I feel horrible when I eat it.
hmm Okay, so this exactly happened to me as well. And unfortunately, Celiac UK are very, very blunt when they talk about this. And what they say is,
Mhm.
in order to get an official diagnosis, you need to be eating gluten in your diet for at least 6 weeks in a meal every day.
Six
Otherwise,
weeks.
higher, yes, 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 yes. So
Wow.
that's the guideline: 6 weeks of gluten in your meal every day for enough of an inflammatory response to be shown in your body for the test to
Yep,
pick it up. So obviously the tests for celiac disease all look at how gluten is affecting your body. But if there's no gluten in your body in the first place, it's obviously not going to pick it up.
of course.
So Celiac UK are very clear that you have to be eating gluten to get tested. I was in that situation myself where my first scope was actually inconclusive, and they were told there's really not much we can do now. So I went off myself and stopped eating gluten and felt instantly better. So I knew myself
Wow.
that something was not right. And I went back to my GP and plucked up the courage and said, listen, I would really like another scope because my antibody count was 10 times higher than average. They did agree to it, but I was very clearly told that we have to wait 6 to 8 weeks for you to eat gluten and then do it. And it was the most horrible 6 to 8 weeks I have ever
Of
had, but
course.
I forced myself through it because it's more important probably to get that diagnosis and have a clear cut sort of answer not only that, but to be able to avail of the free prescription products and to be able to avail of things like your DEXA bone scan and your check for anemia and
Mm,
your check for your blood biomarkers. So it's one of those things where Celiac UK guidelines state that, unfortunately, if you do want the clear diagnosis, you have to push through that and do that for 6 weeks. But for some people, that's incredibly, incredibly difficult.
of course, especially if they have very strong, obvious symptoms. That must
Yes,
be even crippling for some.
and
So
exactly. So it's really up to that person.
there is absolutely no other way to know that?
There is no other way. The only way
Wow.
for you to get a clear celiac diagnosis is through your antibody blood count, and your scope to check for gluten damage. Since COVID, I'm not sure if you've seen this, is in the news recently. They've actually now diagnosing celiac serology blood testing alone, because obviously people aren't able to go to hospital for their
Yeah.
appointments with COVID at the moment, which I really welcome, because with a lot of the scope ratings, and I was an example where mine was inconclusive, that can lead to a lot of false positives or a lot of false negatives, because people
Mm,
automatically start cutting gluten out of their diet when they're told that you have a positive blood test. So unfortunately, at the moment, research is still ongoing. They're looking at different ways, but still the only way to get a clear diagnosis is that.
wow. Okay. And um, what are the early warning signs and symptoms of celiac?
Okay, so I touched on this a wee bit earlier. You've got your classical and your non-classical symptoms. Again, it's like that iceberg analogy. So the tip of the
Mhm.
iceberg would be your classical symptoms, like a lot of flatulence, really chronic diarrhea that's very foul smelling. I'm sorry, this is a little bit.
No,
um,
that's the question. Let's answer the question. Go for it.
a lot of
You're a scientist.
bloating.
We'll take it. It's okay. You had a scientist with us, a nutritionist.
A lot of nausea and vomiting. So they would be the big ones, and failure to thrive in children in particular. And then when we
Mm,
go further down the iceberg, we start to see the non-classical symptoms, which are also early warning signs, like chronic fatigue, tooth enamel, mouth ulcer problems,
mm.
infertility in women, and neurological problems, as well as thyroid dysfunction. So those are the early warning signs, the classical digestive symptoms, and then also the non-classical symptoms that we, as me and you have already discussed,
Yeah,
people don't necessarily associate with celiac.
amazing. And what are the differences and similarities
Mhm.
between celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question, and I do get asked this a lot. So the differences are that celiac disease, the research is well established, and it's a really clear pathway in terms of the etiology of the disease, treatment, and outcomes. Oh, hello, you've gone. Hello. Oh, there you
I'm
are.
here. I'm here. Sorry, I don't know what happened to the
You were
camera
just
there.
gone for two
Sorry.
seconds. Oh, you're
I could hear
gone.
you. You just couldn't see me or hear me.
Oh, okay. I just sort of had a semi-panic there. So, with celiac, the research is really clear and it has a really defined set pathway. It is an autoimmune disease. It's within that family and has a very clear diagnosis and a very clear treatment. With non-celiac gluten sensitivity, it doesn't produce a notable immune response in the body. However, people do seem to have the same highly unpleasant symptoms. So the difference is that you tend to have a bad reaction or cannot digest foods correctly, but you are not receiving the gut damage or the long-term implications that you would with celiac disease. The research isn't clear. Unfortunately, the experts don't agree on non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Some feel that it is gluten, some feel that it's wheat, and some feel that it's some different starch or some different carbohydrates, and more research is needed. So it just doesn't have that set pathway, and there is no diagnostic test for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. At the moment, the gold standard test for it is your food diary, followed by your trial elimination diet, followed by your reintroduction diet. Oh, I can't hear your sound there.
You can hear me now?
Yay, I can hear you again.
Yes, amazing.
Um,
I was saying, wow, so even the experts don't have a definitive answer here.
Yes, they all disagree. And I've read a lot of research studies on it. I'm very much evidence-based nutritionist. And the
Mm-hmm.
research, even the conclusions in a lot of the different research studies state that, yes, gluten can be triggering for a lot of these people. However, it's unclear whether it is specifically the gluten protein or if it's the wheat or if it's different starch. There's not enough research
Mm.
in it. However, that is not taking away the fact that some people do have a sensitivity to gluten, and it does seriously impact on them and reduce their quality of life.
Of course, of course. And even not just intolerance, some people are proper allergic to it. So,
Yeah, so wheat
so for
allergy,
them, it's
yeah, that's
even,
a
yeah,
totally different
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
yeah. Right. So, next question. What are some nutritional considerations people with celiac disease should take? That's a good
Okay.
question, actually.
It is a really good question, and it's something I would know a good bit about. To be honest, this would need to be answered in two parts. And the first part would be nutritional considerations for newly diagnosed celiacs, and
Hmm.
then nutritional considerations for ongoing lifelong celiacs who are just trying to manage their disease from day to day and stick to
Hmm.
gluten free. So, in terms of newly diagnosed celiacs, they would go through a full review with a dietitian, and the main nutrients that would be of immediate concern would be bone health, so vitamin D and calcium. So,
Right.
75% of celiacs have issues with bone mass upon diagnosis. That is huge. So
And that is
basically, what
silent damage that would have probably happened even before they considered they might be celiac.
Yes, exactly. Ongoing
Wow.
damage before, as I said, the average is 13 years in the UK before
Wow.
diagnosis. So this damage could have been going on for quite some time. So calcium and vitamin D is obviously linked to bone health. So usually what would happen is a dietitian would put you on a calcium supplement. So 1,500 milligrams, where usually the average person consumes about 700 milligrams of calcium a day. And then vitamin
Mm.
D works within that complex of the bone health. So osteoporosis would be the first nutritional consideration. And a lot of newly diagnosed celiacs are also anemic. So iron, B12 and folate, that sort of trio of nutrients is linked to your anemia. So a lot of celiacs would be put on ferrous sulfate, which would be an iron supplement
Mm-hmm.
to get them out of that really, really profound fatigue and lethargy that they may be feeling. Then what also needs to be considered for celiacs as well would be things like your vitamin. I talked about your vitamin D with your calcium, magnesium and zinc as well. So
Right.
magnesium tends to be depleted upon chronic diarrhea. So you lose all your magnesium through that. And believe it or not, the majority of the UK population, research studies have shown, are actually deficient in magnesium.
Not me,
Oh, you're
because
doing
I'm
very
eating
good.
cacao the whole day.
Very good, very good. But
Cacao
it's
and
one of those.
magnesium oil.
Oh, great, great. Yeah, it's one of those. Oh, sorry. There we go. It's one of those sort of micronutrients that people tend to miss out on. But in
Yeah.
celiacs in particular, you can be profoundly deficient in it because of the diarrhea.
Mm.
So you would sometimes dietitians would look at sort of like a calcium, magnesium, vitamin D complex all in one. And then the final one for newly diagnosed celiacs would be zinc. So zinc is an absolute wonder mineral in that it has so many functions in the body, but particularly it's linked to digestion and immunity is important for celiacs. And it's not
Mm-hmm.
overly abundant in the average UK diet, actually. So they would be the main things that newly diagnosed celiacs would need to consider. In terms of nutritional considerations for ongoing celiacs, you would like to hope and presume that all the deficiencies when they're first diagnosed have been
Resolve.
managed.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what you would look at in terms of ongoing, and certainly this is what I do myself, is vitamin D. Because the research, particularly the last 5 years, the research has really shown a link between vitamin D and autoimmunity and leaky gut. So a lot of people, particularly elderly and children, should be taking a vitamin D supplement in the winter anyway. But I
Mm.
would say anyone with an autoimmune disease should be taking vitamin D all the year through. And the other thing is omega-3, so your anti-inflammatory foods, so your fatty
Uh-huh.
acids. Because you know this yourself as a diabetic, any autoimmune diseases are pro-inflammatory on the body. So taking an omega-3 anti-inflammatory supplement is really useful in terms of gut microbiome as well. Final thing is, and this one really depends on the person, and people seeking direct medical advice on this would be perhaps considering probiotics. So the research in probiotics has absolutely exploded. So there's about
I've
20.
never taken a probiotic actually.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where us nutritionists and dietitians would never openly tell people to take probiotics unless your issues haven't been resolved through diet. So I would
Right.
never tell people to use a probiotic as a replacement for poor diet. That is just not ideal in terms
I
of
remember
dietary
as a kid,
patterns.
whenever I was given like antibiotics or something, because I used
Mm-hmm.
to get tonsillitis a lot as a kid, until like you, they
Oh,
removed my tonsils.
well,
So easiest option, remove the tonsils. Like when I started having problem with my back, I was like, do we remove the back as well, or how does this work?
very good.
But yeah, I remember as a kid they were telling my mom like, "Oh, you should give her some milk that's gone off because we didn't have the option of probiotics
Hmm.
then." And as a
Hmm.
kid, I hated milk. I wasn't vegan
Oh,
officially, but I hated milk.
hmm.
So,
Yeah,
so my
yeah.
mom, I remember this image of my mom chasing me around the house trying to put some milk that's gone off down my throat, and I'm
Oh
like,
my
"No, it's
word.
from a cow. It's from a cow. Why would I drink milk out of a cow?" I was like, "Can I have dog
Oh,
milk?" And my mom was like, "No, you can't
oh.
have dog milk. What is wrong with you?" And I was like, "Why a cow? I don't like cows."
Oh my word. And probably,
So
obviously, they recommended that. It's because antibiotics has a huge impact on your gut
yes, yes.
microbiome and your gut microflora. And so people who take antibiotics, it's recommended that they either take probiotics or they take the drinks or the yogurts or the homogenized milks that
Right.
contain them. So there is quite a lot of research out there on probiotics, and it's linked to gut microbiome and gut health. And personally, from a professional perspective, I'm fascinated by it, and I would do a lot of
Really?
reading into it.
I'm gonna research it
Um,
now.
Yes, yeah, there's about 20,000 cited articles on PubMed now on probiotics. And certainly, the advice would be obviously try through diet first. But if we were to have clients come back and say, listen, I've done the diet thing, I've tried everything you said, you would then start to say, okay, is there an absence of the main strains of
Mm,
lactobacillus and bifidobacter? And you would maybe then look at specific probiotics to help proliferate that good gut bacteria to reduce leaky gut and
mm.
dysbiosis. So probiotics is something to consider. I would never recommend someone take them off their own bat. I would recommend someone do their reading first and seek advice from a dietitian or nutritionist on it first.
Can we have a one-on-one after this call to take probiotics? I don't trust many nutritionists.
I will say a really good website I do recommend for probiotics. It would be www.usprobioticguide.com.
Okay.
And they,
US.
if yes, that's a great website for people who are considering a probiotic, whether they have IBS or horrible digestive symptoms that can't be resolved through diet alone. And
Mm.
the website shows the different strains linked to the different symptom. So a probiotic,
Really?
yes, a probiotic that's good for bloating, or
Let me
probiotic,
write it again. So
yes,
www.usguide.com.
yes, probioticguide.com.
Awesome.
It's a great resource.
Mm. All right. I'm going to have a look at that. Awesome. And next question.
Mhm.
Did we finish the first one? Did we finish anything
Yes,
else
yes.
for people who had celiac for a while?
So the three big ones for me would be vitamin D, omega-3, and probiotics. Again, all under the advice of someone who's qualified.
Sure. Okay. And the next question is, Sorry, it's loading.
Okay.
What happens if you keep eating gluten with celiac disease? Can you cheat, or how strict does a celiac need to be?
So
Oh,
uh, it's very dangerous for a celiac to keep eating gluten. It's incredibly dangerous. We did discuss earlier, me and you, about the
mm,
different symptoms and how some celiacs are more sensitive to others. But I did mention that the gluten is still doing the damage inside,
yes.
whether you feel it or not. You cannot cheat. You have to be incredibly strict, although some research shows that adherence can be as low as 40% in some celiacs because they
But doesn't
haven't
that have
received.
long-term effect on them?
Yes, yeah, because they just haven't received the education on it. And the long term
Mm,
effects can be quite scary. So, for women, it can be loss of periods, it can be infertility, it can be neurological problems. So,
wow.
issues with anxiety and depression, issues with something called gluten ataxia. And what that is numbness and tingling sensation or loss of coordination.
Wow.
And the other, yes, yeah. And then the other issue is obviously bone health. So developing quite advanced osteoporosis. And the other thing as well is celiacs that don't follow the diet are at much higher risk of developing
Mm,
type 1 diabetes and autoimmune thyroid disease. So,
really?
yeah. And also certain types of cancers, particularly
We
bowel and
have a question about
esophageal.
the link between type 1 diabetes and celiac. I didn't realize they
Mm-hmm.
were linked.
Yeah. Yes, yes. So there's a
Wow.
big link between diabetes and celiac disease.
We do have a question
Um,
on that. We do have a
okay,
question
great.
on that.
So yeah, to summarize that question, no, it's not worth the risk. And I understand. And I have two friends who are celiac, and one of them cheats. They do. And the thing is, it's fine when they eat it and they don't necessarily feel the reaction. I do. I'm
Mm,
incredibly sensitive, but they're doing that long-term damage, and you just don't know what is going to happen to them down the line, and
yeah.
it's just not worth the risk.
There was a brand I was discussing with you before the live, and I was
Mhm.
saying they market themselves as gluten free and vegan, but they do have risk of contamination. And I remember I was trying to buy my friend some donuts because she's gluten free, but she's also nut free. So I couldn't give her something from Yummzy because we use almond flour in everything. So I couldn't buy her
Ah.
something from Yummzy. And I remember going to the market and asking the people selling on the stand and saying, so it's totally gluten free, no risk of contamination. And the lady was like, no, it's gluten free. And I was saying, no, as in no risk of contamination, or no, it's gluten free, but there is risk of contamination. And she just would not give me a direct answer. And
Mhm.
I was actually shocked at how she was trying to conceal the fact they had contamination. And a lot of the people standing in that stand, and a lot of our customers are actually celiacs, and we know they buy from that brand, and we see them buying from that brand. And I even sent the website, like the part of the website that says we cannot guarantee no risk of contamination. And I was saying you
Mhm.
can't really target celiacs and still have contamination. You literally have someone's blood in your hand at that point. And I was asking the lady, so my friend is very celiac. Is she going to enjoy the donuts, or is she going to spend her birthday in the washroom throwing up and all of these things?
Mhm.
And the lady just
Mhm.
couldn't answer my question. And that's when I said to my friend, look, I know you can't have nuts. I can't buy you something from someone else because I don't trust them. So here you go, a bunch of flowers. Eat them, put them in the living room, whatever you want. But I'm not
Oh,
buying you
and
anything. I don't trust anyone with the whole celiac
but
thing.
I think that's testament to you for being such a caring friend and
But it's
really looking out
scary.
for that.
It's
It is
scary. As you
scary.
said,
It
they
is
don't have to show the reaction now, but the damage is being done.
indeed. Yes.
And it's someone's life at hand. So,
It is. It is. It can
yeah,
be life threatening if those are allowed to continue
yeah.
to cause damage. Yeah.
It's the same way. A lot of places market things that are sugar free. And I actually fell for it with a very well known brand. And I couldn't even breathe. Like my husband was
Oh
almost
God.
dragging me down the mall to go back to them, and I was like, "What do you have in there?" And I said, "You say it's sugar free," and I catered for the carbs. I knew it had carbs in it, and they're like, "I knew it had flour," and they were like, "Gluten free flour," and they were like, "Oh, it's gluten free and sugar free," and I was like, "Okay, tell me the first three ingredients. I don't even want to know anything else." And the first three ingredients were gluten-free flour. Okay, I already injected for that. And the second one was coconut sugar. And I was like, how is that
Uh,
sugar free? And they were
yeah,
like, no, but
yeah,
it's not refined sugar. Yeah, but guys, it's gonna kill
yeah.
me exactly the same way as refined sugar. So
It's not added sugar free, but they're still,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It's like
Oh
saying,
gosh.
oh, this doesn't have peanuts. It only has peanut oil, but it doesn't have peanuts. It's ridiculous. But yeah, it's something people really need to watch out for, and
Yes.
especially bloggers, because I realize a lot of bloggers like to take pretty photos of pretty donuts and things like that, but they don't
Mhm.
realize what is in that donut. And even if the brand says gluten free, is this brand actually run by people who have gluten-free people in the family or celiacs in the family? Is it run by people who actually care about that, or are they doing it to make the big buck and, well, the big pound or whatever you call it here, and basically survive as a business in a world where it's almost becoming glamorous to be gluten-free, not just because people are genuinely celiac or gluten-free, but because, people want to avoid gluten, not for health reasons, just because it's the cool thing to do.
Yes,
So
yeah.
I mean,
And
I
that's
avoid
kind of
gluten.
what
I'm guilty of
celiacs.
that, but I'm not doing it because I'm trying to be cool. I avoid it because I don't think it's good for my health.
Yeah, and that I suppose that's something that celiacs are kind of faced with every day,
Yeah,
people not really understanding that it's a separate thing to
yeah,
non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It is a really serious autoimmune disease, and we can't even share the same fryers. So I certainly think that sometimes that can be trivialized or diluted by people that are kind of jumping on a bandwagon,
definitely,
maybe.
definitely, definitely, definitely. But yeah, it's great to raise that part. So I didn't actually know about this until today, but what is the banana diet and is it useful for celiacs?
Okay, so the banana diet is fascinating. It was all the rage when I was in first year university. So in 2008, it just went viral. And it was created by a Japanese couple. And basically it evolves around bananas, but the whole diet doesn't involve eating bananas all day. So some of
Oh,
the main things around the diet are having a banana for breakfast plus a warm cup of water, then not eating after 8 p.m. at night. And another aspect of the diet, I think, is sort of avoiding anything processed. So no alcohol, no refined
mm,
carbohydrates, that kind of thing. Um, in terms of it being useful for celiacs, no, I wouldn't say it is. I mean, bananas are naturally gluten free, and I would never say to anyone to restrict their intake of, whole foods in terms of fruit and veg. But celiac disease individuals already have to restrict gluten. So I would never then encourage them to then restrict another aspect and then go on a different diet as well, because that can create perhaps issues with disordered eating, negative
mm,
food patterns. And it's the same for me. I mean, I already feel sorry for myself because I have to restrict gluten.
no,
So then I would therefore not be recommending that you then have to, on top of that, incorporate another restrictive diet. So for me, it's not something I would recommend for celiacs. Having to go gluten free and trying to manage those potential nutritional deficiencies is already tough enough for someone who just wants to live their life. So it's
mm.
not something I would recommend for celiacs.
To be honest, if it wasn't for the carbs, I would happily sign up for a banana diet. It's my favorite fruit. But being low carb and all this, I don't go anywhere
Sorry.
near bananas. But
Yeah.
the whole idea of living on bananas, even when you said it's not necessarily just based on bananas, I was like, I'm okay with
Mhm.
bananas. Just remove the carbs.
The other thing is,
But
with too many
yeah,
bananas, you risk potassium poisoning. And it happened to my friend's grandmother who was hospitalized because all she was doing was eating bananas and grapes.
that's
So there's the
bad.
other side of the scale as well. So it's all about
Yeah,
balance and
yeah, yeah. The body
moderation,
is a
really.
balance. I read
Mhm.
about the banana diet earlier, and it's interesting. Apparently, in the 90 until the 1950s, they didn't understand that celiac disease was linked to gluten.
Yes, yes,
So they
yes,
used to put people on a diet where they could only eat bananas to keep them
yes,
okay. But then when they realized it's linked to gluten, they were like, okay, just cut out the gluten, eat anything you want. Just cut out the
yes.
gluten.
Oh, it's great that you know that, actually. That's spot on. Yeah, they
I
used
only
to
knew about
actually
it
give them
today.
bananas. Yeah, they used to give them bananas, and then when they finally realized it was actually specifically gluten, the protein, and not the actual carb, then they were like, have at it.
Imagine if someone like me is low carb and avoiding gluten, whether they're celiac or not, but they're avoiding gluten, and they're suddenly told you have to eat bananas for the rest of your life. Well, I'm low carb. Okay, I'll drink the water. I'll skip the banana. I'll survive on water and solar energy. That's how I'm gonna do it.
If only.
If only. Awesome. This is similar to a question we went through earlier, but we're gonna just
Mhm.
answer it at a high level.
Yeah.
What are the nutrients a gluten-free person could be deficient in or needs to focus on?
Okay. So the
The
first.
second question is also related to that. So it's saying, what nutrients or supplements would you recommend? So let's see the which parts a gluten-free person is deficient in, and we can also try to incorporate the next one, which is what supplements should they take? I know you mentioned the answers earlier, but just to give it at a higher
Yes.
level.
Sorry, I'm just trying to something came up on my screen there. So yeah, in terms of that, I suppose the first thing to distinguish is that there is a difference between nutrients or supplements that people with celiac disease need versus
Mm-hmm.
nutrients or supplements that someone who is gluten-free or gluten intolerant need.
Mm-hmm.
So with celiac disease, you are getting to a very high level. So you're looking at really specific supplements that addresses the fact that you have such intense and profound gut damage that we need to heal the gut.
Mm.
Whereas people with gluten-free who exclude gluten from their diet because, they do have a sensitivity, they do have an overreaction to it, the three main things you would need to consider there would be fiber, vitamin B, and vitamin D. Because
Okay.
if you cut gluten out of your diet, you tend to sort of not eat foods that are cereal grain based, and a lot of cereal grain based foods are actually fortified with vitamins B and vitamin D,
Yeah.
whereas a lot of gluten free foods aren't. So fiber, vitamin B, and vitamin D are the three things that gluten free people need to consider. Whereas with celiac disease, I kind of touched on that in a lot of detail earlier. You're looking way more specifically at the gut damage and healing the fact that
Mm.
the gut, the villi in the gut, which are the finger-like projections, need to be come back upright again. So when you're celiac, the villi, which are the finger-like projections which absorb the nutrients, become flat. And what you want to do is get them back up standing so they're absorbing all the nutrients coming through. So that would be more specifically iron, vitamin D, calcium, zinc, those kind of things. So there is a difference between nutritional considerations for the two conditions.
Amazing. And that was very good for people who are also gluten free to know the difference and how it affects
Yes.
them.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know? I know your family is a fan of our products. Did you know Yummzy products have higher fiber than carbs?
That is amazing. I'm so impressed by that. Honestly, because with my fascination in gut health, fiber is all the research studies have come out
Yeah,
with recently. And that's really great to hear that even though your products are low carb, they're high fiber. That's so impressive.
they are. And we don't do what other low carb bakeries do, where they add gluten. Like they add gluten as a protein to make it low carb, high protein, but also like the bread is fluffy or this or that. We actually use really expensive ingredients, 3 times the cost of gluten, just to be able to achieve that without gluten, without eggs. And
Yeah.
obviously, it gives the high amount of fiber as well. So
Oh,
it's really
that's
funny because
brilliant.
one of my friends was saying like her daughter is constantly constipated, her daughter is constant, and I was like, why don't you give her one of our cupcakes? And she was like, as if a cupcake will help her. And I said, well, it's sugar free, it's not going to harm her, so let her just enjoy the
Mhm.
cupcake. The
Mhm.
next thing we know, she was like, I need more cupcakes. That child needs a cupcake per day from you guys.
Oh, no, it's great to hear because you know
So
yourself,
yeah.
some people kind of view certain products as being really high in sugar. But the fact that you've actively gone out of your way to try and include fiber in your products is a really
Yes.
unique selling point and really good.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. We love hearing things like that. So, how do you flush gluten out of your system?
Okay. There's three ways to do this.
There are
There's
actually ways. We used to get people in the shop asking for a charcoal latte to flush out gluten, and I never believed this actually works. I made it for them, but I never believed it works.
So in terms of the three ways, I sort of mean there's three sources of gluten
Yeah,
in terms of not a specific food or a specific tablet, but there's obvious sources of gluten, non-obvious sources of gluten, and the cross-contamination sources of gluten.
of course.
So basically to flush it out of your system, you just have to basically cut all forms of gluten out of your diet. But the problem is a lot of people don't realize that there's so many sources of gluten in foods that they wouldn't even associate with it. And
I
it really
know.
caught me out at the start. Like, obviously the obvious ones, and most people will know this, is anything with white flour in it. So bread, pastry, buns,
Vegan
biscuits,
cheese.
obviously.
Vegan cheese also has gluten
Yes.
sometimes,
Uh-huh.
which baffles me. Like, why would you put gluten in a cheese? What? Why would you put gluten in a cheese?
Yeah.
A vegan
And
cheese?
and vegan bean burgers as well is a nightmare, because
Really?
I'm interested in that as well, and they're filled with gluten as a binder, because the
Wow.
non-obvious sources are people using gluten as a binder or filler or carrier. So in
Mm,
gravies, soy sauce contains gluten, some of the little
yes.
packets of peri
That was
peri
heartbreaking
seasoning.
for me, the whole soy sauce thing.
Yeah,
Anti-use, which I can't have either.
I
But yeah.
know. So that's sort of the main way to do it. Cut out the obvious sources, which is your wheat flour. Cut out your non-obvious sources, so things where you wouldn't suspect it, where it can be hidden. And that's a case of really reading the label very, very carefully.
Mm,
The third one then is cross-contamination, and we both did talk about this earlier.
yeah.
If someone is celiac and has come back to their dietitian and has said, "Listen, I've cut out gluten. I don't know why I'm still sick," 9 times out of 10, it's because they are
Yeah.
getting it through cross contamination. There is something called refractory celiac disease, and it's incredibly rare. And it's in like something like 0.5% of celiacs, where even though they have gone gluten free and they've been diagnosed, that they still have ongoing symptoms. So there's two
Mm,
specialist centres in the UK that deal with people who have refractory celiac disease. But majority of cases, people are just getting it through cross contamination, whether that's through shared utensils, the same oil has been used,
yes.
or they're mixing things within the cupboard. So they're the three things
Or
that I
even
would
the
say.
original ingredients. Like, I know, for example, we use almond flour, and
Mhm.
it would cost us much less to buy almond flour from a certain supplier. I'm talking, it would cost us about 8 or 9 pounds a kilogram, but we actually buy it from another supplier where it costs 13 pounds a kilogram. Why? Because the 13 pounds a kilogram one guarantees no risk of gluten contamination. The other one says like it doesn't even say gluten free or contains gluten. But when we asked them about the contamination, they were like, we cannot guarantee that because
Yeah.
our warehouses, we handle things with gluten, and these are not seal packed. So basically, and it's a very well known brand that has big affluent supermarkets around London. But we couldn't go with that because we have lives in our hands. So we just
Mhm.
had to switch to the more expensive one, even if it hits our margin, and make sure that it is safe for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great thing to do. And there's no cost and there's no price on your health, but
No,
it's so great that you can sit there and confidently say, yes, we can cater for celiacs.
exactly. And not even
Mhm.
some places advertise themselves as celiac friendly, but they use that brand that we refuse to use. So sometimes they even
Yeah,
wonder, like, how can you do that? It's not secure.
yeah. There's just always going to be that
Yeah.
question. There's always going to be the cross contamination aspect.
So, is there a way to flush it out of your system? What about this charcoal latte that every single celiac that came to our shop was asking for? Does it? I know charcoal helps with poisons in the body. I know, like,
Hmm.
if I had a really bad hangover, I would have a charcoal latte the next day. But I didn't know it helps with gluten. But some people strongly believe in that.
Um, yeah, I mean, I suppose from my point of view, I state everything that is evidence based and is found in the literature, and there certainly isn't anything that has been researched as some
Really?
wonder food or superfood to initially flush gluten out of your system. It's a case of just
Wow.
stopping eating it and just letting it deplete itself. And there
And if
is no
someone is
wonder
gluten,
cure.
if
Pardon?
someone is gluten, there's definitely nothing that charcoal can do for them.
Not that would be of significance that has shown up
Oh,
in research studies. And if something doesn't show up as statistically significant in a research study, it's something you would query. And certainly, if you're a registered nutritionist or dietitian, you have to be very
mm,
careful about recommending foods where
of
the
course.
scientific basis is not quite there. So I can only sit here and say, nope, there is nothing I can say apart from cutting gluten out of your system, drinking loads and loads of water, and
Yes,
ensuring that you keep up your fiber intake.
yes, yes. Uh, that's good to know. We have a few questions. Someone just said thank you about that. I was constantly drinking. I was constantly drinking charcoal lattes. Okay, we're never going to be selling this person charcoal latte again. But I was constantly drinking charcoal lattes for every time I got accidentally gluten. Good to know that wouldn't help me. Although I do like the taste. Yeah, continue buying it from us once we reopen, please. Don't let this put you off.
Yeah, listen, if people feel that it helps ease their symptoms, even if that's a placebo effect, there's no harm in drinking it. So there can be, you wouldn't necessarily get sick from taking a charcoal, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to significantly help you either. So sometimes it can be a bit of a placebo effect. So if you like it and you enjoy it and it doesn't have any gluten in it, it's not going to harm you, but there's no scientific research to show that it's going to significantly help you either. I think that's probably a balanced
Right.
response.
Yes, yes, indeed, indeed. And as you saw, we have a few thank yous for the information as well. And we have a few questions, which I'm going to try and summarize with what we have already. So, going back to our existing questions, and then we will add all the other questions at the end. We'll summarize them. Um, Top tips to avoid cross contamination in your home if you live with people who are not celiac.
Okay, yeah, I think this is an absolutely brilliant question.
Because let's face it,
I
a lot of people are not celiac and share homes with
Mhm.
celiacs. So
Yes,
you can't tell everyone in the house, don't have gluten. But at the same
exactly.
time, you can't suffer and affect yourself long term.
Yeah, I think you've made a really good point there. And I mean, my fiance, he isn't gluten free, and he eats gluten because he
And you
enjoys
guys
it. And
kiss after he eats gluten?
genuinely, if he's drinking beer, there is a fear.
Oh,
But certainly, if you're living with someone who is not gluten free, and I think it's particularly important for people in house shares who is in like multiple occupancies where they're sharing with a number of people, I feel like you need to create something called a celiac safe space, and it's what I call it. And what that means is having a section just for yourself, which is your gluten free celiac safe space, where everything is labeled as gluten free, everything is sealed correctly. So what
including
I do,
utensils.
yes. So what I do myself is I keep my flours, my bags of flour rolled up and pegged. And even though it says gluten free on the product, I do write a big GF in black marker,
Amazing.
and I buy sealed containers. The other thing I do as well is I recommend keeping a separate toaster or having toaster bags, because again, you risk
I
getting the
just buy
crumbs.
Yummzy bread. It will
Pardon?
satisfy, just buy Yummzy bread. It will satisfy
Yes,
the celiac and it will
yes.
satisfy the non-celiac.
The other thing I would probably recommend is keeping your own condiments. So things like butters and jams. Obviously, you can get crumbs if people
Of
use their
course.
knife for their bread. Also, in terms of utensils, I would probably recommend keeping your own chopping boards, but I wouldn't go as far as to keep your own utensils, maybe, or your own pots and pans. But what I would recommend is having the conversation with the people you live with,
Hmm.
explaining to them how serious celiac disease and cross contamination is, and maybe discussing how, without offending, how thorough you have to be with cleaning
Yeah.
these products, and to not just use water, use soap and water. And the other thing, which has been an issue in my household is when I have been cooking pasta. And for my fiance, I cook my own gluten-free pasta. Usually I use chickpea or lentil pasta,
Mm.
and his pasta, the same spoon can sometimes be used to stir them. Again, that can be a
Ah,
contentious issue. And I've caught him out a couple of times. So it's just about making sure that you're not
yeah.
cross using samples as well. So they would be my main tips. Create your own celiac safe space, use your own toaster or toast bags, use your own condiments, and have that really important conversation with the people that you live with. Communicate in a way where they understand how important it is to clean things correctly.
Mm-hmm. And maybe also your own separate sponge for cleaning afterwards, like
Yes,
what do you call it, the thing for a scrubber or whatever it is. So
that's a
maybe have
really
your
good
own
point.
cleaning. Yeah, because
Hmm.
you don't want to
Yeah,
end up
definitely.
contaminating through soap and water,
Exactly, and particularly if
especially if someone
you
hot
live,
washes things.
particularly if you live in a house of multiple occupancy, keeping
Yes,
your own
yes,
sponges is definitely something I would recommend.
yeah, definitely. We just got a question online. A lady is asking, um, can we be fine with gluten, not show any intolerance, but still put on a lot of weight extremely fast just by touching or eating bread?
Okay, so the question is, if you were to eat gluten and you're not intolerant, you can gain a lot of weight. Is that what
So
they
she
mean?
doesn't think she's intolerant, but she
Okay.
seems to be gaining weight much faster than if eating anything else with carbs,
Uh-huh.
but also much faster eating bread.
Yeah.
I will
Okay.
put my 2 pence here, and then you can add
Hmm.
your own
Yeah.
scientific side of things. So, my answer to this question, the lady who asked it, in general, our body doesn't like toxins. And toxins can be anything from alcohol to things that are not toxin, but just to our body, they are toxin or foreign. So, in my case, maybe sugar is toxic for my body because I can't process sugar. For someone who's celiac or gluten intolerant, gluten can be a toxin in this case. For someone else, it could be alcohol. For someone else, it's cigarettes. Well, for humanity in general, it's cigarettes and alcohol in high amounts. But the moment we put toxins in our body, the body tries to protect itself. The body is constantly trying to balance things out and protect itself. So my advice on this would be, if your body is sensitive to gluten, same as any other toxin, it will protect itself by holding on to fat to protect the organs in the body and keep them safe. Now, maybe that is why you realize when you are quitting bread, you're losing a lot of weight, not just from quitting, because from her question, it seems she quits carbs and they don't make her lose as much weight as quitting bread, or she gains much faster weight eating bread. So maybe you are intolerant to gluten, and maybe your body's way of reacting to it is shielding itself by keeping fat next to the precious organs like the liver and this and that. And but that's my interpretation. I haven't studied nutrition in a decade. I did a diploma in it, but I haven't studied it since then. So over to you, Orla.
Yeah, so my take on that would be that a lot of it depends on the type of bread that you're eating, but most bread is highly refined and highly processed. So that automatically is going to cause a negative pro-inflammatory effect in the body. And
Okay.
with those type of foods, that's then going to create bloating, that's going to create abdominal distension, and that's going to cause you to hold on to your water weight. So what a lot of people find is then when they cut out bread, they tend to have less bloating because what they've done is they've naturally cut out highly processed refined foods.
Mm,
So a lot of that might be around the fact that when she is eating bread, more often than not, most breads are refined and processed. It's going to create that negative inflammatory effect on their
with a lot
body.
of salt as well.
Exactly. So she's obviously noticing that bread is one of those triggers, and that's what's causing
Mm.
the weight gain, particularly in terms of her body holding on to water weight. So, what I would say is listen, if it's causing you a problem, just cut down on the amount of bread that you eat. And that's just a really simple problem solved.
Amazing. And another question. Well, this one is already one that we have. What are the long-term effects of celiac and what happens? We already answered that, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Okay, we'll move on. Can I have oat or oat
Mhm.
milk? It doesn't contain gluten, but I react badly to it.
Yes, so this is a really good question. So oats are quite contentious when it comes to celiac disease, but the direct scientific answer is that oats are naturally gluten free. However, oats are then contaminated with gluten during the harvesting and milling process.
Oh,
So any celiacs that ingest oat will have a reaction to it. Now, there are gluten free uncontaminated oats available on the market, and the majority of celiacs um, can basically tolerate those oats. However, a very select few, small amount of celiacs react to a protein in oats called avenin, and that is toxic to some celiacs. And so, what I would say is, you react badly to oat or oat milk, just avoid oats at all costs, because you could be that very small percentage of celiacs that
hmm,
react badly to avenin. For me personally, I can tolerate gluten free oats. However, I have noticed a difference between brands. So for one oat
really?
brand, yes, yeah, there's one in particular where I had an instant reaction to, even though it was gluten free, uncontaminated oats, and another I didn't have a reaction to. So whether it was fully cleansed of gluten or uncontaminated, or
Hmm,
whether I do have a mild reaction to the protein avenin is yet to be discovered and wouldn't really be confirmed by any sort of diagnostic testing. So, what I would say is try the gluten free, uncontaminated oats. You are not able to get oat milk on the market, as far as I know, that is gluten free and uncontaminated. So, if you're
yeah.
reacting badly to it, just avoid it.
Yeah, which is the reason in Yummzy we never served oat milk. We tried it for a period, but that period we couldn't sell to celiacs.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. That's intriguing. I knew about the
Mm-hmm.
protein in oats that causes some
Mm-hmm.
issues for celiacs, but
Yeah.
I didn't realize for sometimes it does the issues, sometimes it doesn't.
Yes.
Maybe it's
Yeah.
also how it's processed. Maybe the more it's
Mm-hmm.
processed, the less
Yes.
potent it is, or maybe the more potent it is, or
Yeah.
that's intriguing.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Next question. Why are a lot of gluten-free foods so full of sugar? Story of my life.
Oh dear. Okay. So, um, you've seen this. A lot of people have seen this. The free from market has absolutely boomed. In fact, interesting stat for you. It's worth 835 million a
Yeah.
year annually in the UK now. So the problem is a lot of people who decide they want to go gluten free because it's healthier or because they will lose more weight but do
Mm.
not have any medically diagnosed condition. The first place they will go to instead of naturally cutting gluten out of their diet is straight down the free from aisle. Okay.
But we are bred in a way where we want our comforts, we want our biscuits,
Mm-hmm.
we want our bread,
Yeah.
we want this, we want that. I mean, even when I joined university, I remember kids were constantly eating chocolates around me. And I just arrived in the UK. I grew up in Africa. I grew up in East
Yeah.
Africa. So in my case, like, okay, there were chocolates, but being diabetic and chocolates that were usually very unhealthy because they were way past the expiry date and so on. So for us, a treat was an orange or a treat was a
Mm-hmm.
fruit. So I remember, like, even my friends when they were eating like Mars bar and this and that. And at the time, I wasn't even low carb. But for me, I'd be like, I'm gonna have an apple or something like that, and they
Mm-hmm.
would laugh at me. But if I grew up in a country where like I was constantly bombarded by colors and cakes and biscuits and chocolate bars, I would straight away go to the free from section. I'm not even going to think about what other
Mm-hmm.
ingredients are
Yeah.
in it.
Yeah, yeah. And I totally understand that. And you're right, it is a comfort thing because you're going to
Yeah.
something that you know. The problem is a lot of research has been done into these free from products. And the most recent research study I can quote, because again, I'm all about the evidence base and being able to quote
Yeah.
statistics that are factually scientific. So Safe Food in Ireland, the most recent one is done this year, 2020, and they looked at 67 free from products in the gluten-free aisle. And out of the 67, 75% were higher in fat and 69% were higher in sugar. Because they have to replace the absence of gluten.
Yeah.
Because gluten, as I mentioned in the very first question, is the protein that provides elasticity, provides texture, and provides bounce. So
Yeah.
when the gluten is removed, it's hard, it's dense, and you basically want the consumer to have a positive experience. And so what you're going to do is add more sugar, salt, and fat to basically make up for that. So that's why
Compensate.
they're so full of sugar. They're trying to replace the gluten that has been lost. I wouldn't recommend anyone
And sugar is the
to.
easiest winner. Like, let's face it, if you put sugar even on your hand, you're gonna have a high
Mhm.
and happy from that. So
Yes,
it's the
yes,
cheapest and easiest replacement, really.
yeah. So that's why they are. That's why they're so full of sugar. It's to replace the gluten that's lost and try and make up for that.
You were saying you would recommend or you wouldn't recommend to
I
anybody.
wouldn't recommend anyone who isn't celiac or isn't gluten intolerant to use these free from products because they are the research is very clear. They're higher in this. We're not talking about Yummzy. We know Yummzy's low in sugar. We know Yummzy.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But what I'm talking about are these own
We
brand
only use healthy
supermarkets.
fats. We're not low in fat, but we only
Exactly.
use very healthy fats that
You
your body
use
needs.
unsaturated fats, exactly. So I'm more specifically talking about these supermarket brands, and the
Yeah.
research is really clear on that. So do not take those products. And what you're also doing then is taking them away from people who actually need them. So people who have
Yeah.
celiac disease
I
and who.
remember at the beginning of lockdown, because my husband can't have gluten. He's not celiac, but he's very intolerant to gluten, like rash, everything. And I remember at the beginning of lockdown, it was a nightmare to get like gluten-free bread. And at the time, we were not making Yummzy bread because we couldn't get one of the suppliers to give us what we needed. So there was a point where my husband was like, I'm just gonna eat gluten and take the outcome of it. And I was like, no, we're gonna work
Oh,
through this. Let's try
oh,
rice. And then rice was also sold out. Let's try
yes.
this. And it was a nightmare.
I had the exact same situation. I almost threw a strop in the supermarket because I
I
walked on.
don't blame you.
Honestly, I was so angry. I walked down the aisle and it was just bare. And I've
Yeah.
never seen the free from section empty in my life. And I just felt it was so selfish for people who have genuine medical conditions who need these foods. Thankfully,
Yeah.
I got them on prescription then, but some people aren't so lucky. But yeah, I
No.
wouldn't recommend it.
It's true. Right. What is the link? This question was asked over 4 times, and it was asked now in the live comments on YouTube. What is the link between type 1 diabetes and celiac disease?
Okay, so there is a big link, and they're both autoimmune diseases. So I mentioned an autoimmune disease is where the body attacks its own tissues and its own organs. So people who are type 1 diabetic are between 4 to 8% more likely to develop celiac disease than the average population, which is only 1%. So that's the stats on it. It's
Can you repeat those
because,
stats again, please, so
yeah,
people can hear
so
them again?
yes, if you have type 1 diabetes, you're 4 to 8% more likely to develop celiac disease as opposed to the average population, which is 1%. And that's
Wow.
because if you've been diagnosed with one autoimmune disease, you are at much higher risk of developing another in conjunction with it.
Mm.
Um, it's a lot to do with pro-inflammatory responses in the body. It's also vice versa. So if you have celiac disease, you're also more likely to develop type 1 diabetes. So it goes
Hmm.
both ways. And the link is because they're both autoimmune diseases, and you're more genetically predisposed to it. So it's unfortunate, but it's unfortunately a very real thing.
And it makes sense. It makes sense. They're both autoimmune diseases, so yeah, it makes sense. 4 to 8 times. That's really high. That's like
Yeah,
four to eight times
48%.
what a normal
Yeah.
person
Hmm.
percentage
Yeah,
is.
yeah, you're
Exactly.
certainly more at risk. Yeah.
Any advice for someone who is celiac or just gluten intolerant, other than what we've already discussed?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people tend to say to me, "What are your three top tips for people, who are following this type of diet?" So I kind of touched on one earlier, and my first advice would be: do not make these free from products the bulk of your diet. Try to
Mm-hmm.
incorporate naturally gluten-free foods in there. So I'm talking a combination of whole foods, plant-based, lots of fruit and veg, and sort of lean meats if you're a vegan or vegetarian, beans, pulses, and legumes. So don't rely on these free from products as the main bulk of your diet. The other thing I would say is some people restrict themselves to just having rice and potatoes as their
I can't
main
have
kind
rice.
of.
I can't have potatoes. Both are high carb.
Yes,
So
I
moving
know
on.
that for
That's for
yourself.
other
Yeah,
people.
yeah. But certainly for other people, they kind of box themselves in. And
Mm,
the issue is with too much rice, you do risk arsenic, because all we know is that rice can be high in arsenic. And if it's eaten in really high quantities, that can be
yeah.
dangerous. So experiment with other grains that are higher in fiber or iron. So things like quinoa, amaranth, and buckwheat are really high in fiber, and millet and buckwheat, those kind of things. So what I would say is get out of that potato and rice trap and really try and experiment with different grains as well. So they would be my two pieces of advice I always give people outside of the kind of nutritional considerations when it comes to celiac disease. And I suppose the other thing is try and live your life as positively as you possibly can with the disease. Yes, it's
Vegan
horrible.
health.
Yes, you know this yourself. Autoimmunity is a really horrible thing, and you can really suffer from some terrible side effects. But if you try and get a healthy balance and a great variety of different things in your diet, you really will help those outcomes and those side effects, and you will improve your quality of life. So it's about positive management of the disease as well.
Amazing. That's really good advice. And should people that don't have gluten intolerance avoid gluten in general, and why? Don't
Okay.
worry, they're not gonna go to the free from aisle. They're just saying avoid gluten. So try other things.
Yeah, so this is a very contentious topic, a very contentious issue. I get asked this a lot, and I can understand why, because the emergence of gluten-free and, it potentially being great for health or great for weight loss has really exploded in the last kind of 10 years. Personally, and I am basing this on the evidence base that's out there in sound scientific studies, they do show quite clearly that people that don't have a negative effect when they eat gluten shouldn't avoid it. And it's for a number of reasons. And I can quote a few scientific studies to back this up. And a big one was one recently released in the British Medical Journal. So I think this was a 2016 study. And they actually looked at diets of people that weren't intolerant, but did follow a gluten-free diet. And it
Mm,
showed that they were actually at a higher risk of increased cardiovascular disease, because what they were
the
inadvertently
lower
doing
fiber as well.
was the lower fiber. So they were
Yeah.
cutting out whole grains unintentionally. The other things as well is if you restrict one food group when you don't need to, you're potentially depleting yourself of essential nutrients. And the big ones I mentioned are fiber, but also vitamins B and vitamins D. I mean, I'm
Mm.
very much the mantra, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So if you feel you can eat gluten and it's not having a negative impact on you, there's clearly not going to be an issue, so you don't need to avoid it. But the other thing I would say is, if you view it as something where you're going to be healthy, or if it's a bit of a fad, you're making life much harder for people that genuinely have an issue with it. So you're trivializing it for people with celiac disease and people with a gluten
Mm.
intolerance who have to live this every day without any sort of get up. And it's things like in restaurants where, and I have been out with people that have sort of said to the waiter, "Oh, I'm gluten free." And then in the next breath, they've ordered a sticky toffee pudding for dessert, because they're only kind of doing it because they think it's healthier. And when you sit there as a celiac, it's very hard to stomach that because you do feel like it's trivializing your condition. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't say you need to avoid gluten. You're risking restricting your fiber intake. You're risking perhaps negative food restriction and negative thoughts around food when you don't actually need to. So what I would say is, if you feel you're having negative symptoms when you're ingesting gluten, go get it checked out with your GP to rule out celiac and to rule out gluten intolerance. If that's been ruled out, look at maybe perhaps looking at cutting out processed or refined carbs. Because 9 times out of 10, when people cut out gluten, gluten's mainly found in those type of foods. So it's not actually the gluten that's the issue. It's just the fact that you're eating a lot of refined processed carbohydrates in your
Yeah.
diet.
Yeah.
So,
Or yeast, because for a lot of people, yeast
yes,
is an issue. So yeah.
yes, yeah. So I wouldn't recommend it from a scientific and nutritionist point of view.
So I'm gonna play devil's advocate here because I
Please,
don't
by
like
all means.
gluten, and I'm publicly loud about it.
Yeah, by all means,
um,
by all means. There's so many different arguments.
so so I personally believe that the gluten we have in our diets nowadays is much higher than the gluten. Like if you eat a cake nowadays, okay, forget cake, it's high sugar, high everything else. But let's say you eat a home baked bread or cake, and you eat a home cake bread or cake about 3 generations ago.
Yeah.
So I strongly believe what we're eating nowadays will have much higher gluten. Even if it's home baked, it's only worse when you buy stuff from the supermarket because let's face it, gluten will make it fluffier, it will bind it better, it will do all these things. So it works out much cheaper to just throw in gluten than add other ingredients that are worth more, have for more fiber, have more things. And unfortunately, I think if I eat bread now, like non Yummzy bread, just bread from the shelf of the supermarket, or even a low carb bread, they have added gluten to them. So you're suddenly getting 2 or 3 times the normal amount of gluten you would take. Now, as people, if we go back to our caveman or ancestor days, okay, maybe we were exposed to wheat, maybe we were exposed to gluten, but the amount of work it took to actually grind that and make it into flour, and the amount of time it took to actually get that right amount of heat to make something useful out of the flour, or even just 1400s or whatever. It was totally different to make bread with gluten then than it is now, because now you can even buy gluten off the shelf and just add it to your gluten the flour, or you can just buy flour with extra gluten. You have all of these options, which I think totally throw things off balance, because while the bread maker will not tell you actually our bread has more gluten than normal, so even if you usually tolerate gluten, it might affect you badly because it's going to take it up a notch. They're not going to be that transparent about it. They're just going to sell it to you and say bread contains gluten. Full stop. It's not going to say it contains 3 times the gluten of your grandmother's cake or bread. So I'm a bit, yeah, for me, I mean, I'm low carb anyway, so I don't touch anything that's without gluten, whether gluten free or just bread or whatever. But I'm also yeast intolerant, so even if it's gluten free bread, guess what? If it has yeast, it's going to kill me as well. So, so in my case, I avoid it in general. But even with my husband, for example, like he used to say, when I was growing up, I could eat bread and I didn't have a problem. And now I eat bread and I just feel horrible and I feel sick and I get rash and this and that. And I always remind him, honey, the bread you were eating when you were a kid didn't have as much gluten as the bread you're eating now. Now it's almost like a like a commercial thing. The more gluten we add, the cheaper it's going to be. So let's add more gluten to the equation. So these
Mhm.
are my thoughts on it.
No, I understand where you're coming from, and I think where the link with that is certainly now with those type of products, they are more processed, they are more refined,
Hmm.
and they have a lot more E numbers, additives, and
Oh,
preservatives, which compounds that negative response in the body. So, and that kind of goes back to my argument earlier with the non-celiac gluten sensitivity and all the specialists not
mm,
agreeing, because a lot of them feel that it is the gluten but then a lot of them feel that actually no, it's the weight or it's a different sugar or a different starch, and there just
Yeah.
isn't enough research out there to specifically define if it is or not. But I definitely agree with you that definitely nowadays bread is far more processed, it's far more
Yeah.
refined. It has probably caused a higher concentration of a reaction from the gluten than it would have done previously. And I suppose as well another argument would be sort of the pesticides and what's used as well
Yes.
in terms of on
Yes.
these crops.
The
And you can
GMO.
argue, yeah, that it could be linked also to that as opposed to just the gluten, because remember,
Mm.
gluten is just a collection of proteins found in grains. And what it might actually be is not the gluten, but all these other ingredients and pesticides that then compound the gluten and make it so much more toxic than it actually is.
Yeah.
So it could be a lot of those different things. The problem is we just don't know because there's just not enough research yet. And I, for one,
We
cannot
need more
wait
research
for
on
more
this. We
research
need
to
more
come
research.
out.
Guys, scientists out there, do something,
Please.
please, for the sake of all those who need it. And
Yeah,
Yummzy.
definitely. I know.
I see, I see. And well, this is our last question, unless we get other questions. I just said last question, and something did pop up actually in the comments. Someone is asking, if I have gluten-free beer, I still don't feel well. Why is that?
Yeah, so I'm on the same boat as you, whoever that lovely commenter was. So when it comes to gluten-free beer, there's two types out there. There is beer where they physically remove the gluten, and there's beer where they basically manufacture and create it without any gluten from the very start. So, for any beer to be labeled gluten free, it has to be less than 20 parts per million.
Mm-hmm.
But depending on how sensitive you are as a celiac, will depend on whether you react to a beer that has had the gluten removed after or has been manufactured from the start. I myself find that I react to different brands. So, there's certain amount that are stricter than others. So if you're finding that you're still reacting to gluten-free beer, I would then look into beers that have specifically been manufactured from the start as being free from gluten.
Right. That's
So
very
there's
interesting. And
yeah,
they're
yeah.
both labeled gluten free, or one says naturally gluten free and one says removed gluten, or
So yeah, they're both labeled gluten free. So anything that's less than 20 parts per million in it can legally be
wow.
gluten free. But what you might want to do is do your research on the brands of beer and check if the gluten has been removed after or they've naturally been made as gluten free. And from there, you can try it and see if you have a different reaction.
Wow, that's good to know. Hey, I can't have beer, so I never knew that. So
Yeah, yeah. It is fascinating. It really is.
wow, that's almost as shocking as when I realized beer is not vegan, and most of beers are not.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's really strange.
It is, it is, and wines. I mean, how bizarre is that? But never mind.
Yeah.
So, last question, unless something else comes up, is what are your favorite gluten-free facts and myths versus myths?
Yeah, okay. So I kind of touched on this earlier, and the big thing I said was the free from products. So people presuming that they're healthier when they aren't always. The other one, and we did discuss this as well, is my favorite myth is that you can outgrow celiac disease. You can't.
Yeah.
Um, it's lifelong autoimmune disease. And I suppose my favorite fact about gluten free, my favorite fact would be you can still live a really happy, healthy life with having celiac disease. It don't let it control you. Yes, be cautious. Yes, be aware, but don't let that turn into crippling anxiety. And you can lead a really happy, healthy life. And that is, for me, a gluten free fact.
Wow. Amazing. And I had a question actually. Gluten, and I forgot the question because I saw a comment pop up. Sorry. Just let me read the comment if it's something we haven't answered already. Um, So yes, actually, that was my question. Do we know? Do we have like a statistic of what amount of people are gluten intolerant compared to non-gluten intolerant? Like, is there a statistic regardless of tests? Like, do we know that, I don't know, 1 out of 4 people are gluten intolerant even if they don't know about it or something like that? I know there would be a different statistic for celiac and a different statistic for gluten intolerant. The
Yeah.
question was for celiac. My question is for gluten intolerant, even without the testing. But we just know, like, for example, we know X amount of people have type 2 diabetes, but they don't even know about
Yeah.
it.
Yes. Okay. So
As an
there's a few
estimate.
different stats out there that I know off the top of my head. So for celiac disease, it's 1 in 100 people in the UK that have it.
Wow, that's still high.
Um, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And for IBS, it's 1 in 5 suffer from IBS. Um,
Wow.
yeah, which is a dysfunctional
And IBS
thyroid
is
gland.
still affected by gluten, not just sugar, yeast, and things like that.
Oh, IBS is so multifaceted. I could talk about 5 hours
Yeah,
about
because I
IBS,
have a
but
few friends who
gluten,
have IBS, and
yeah, it
none
can
of
be
them
one of the
avoid
triggers.
gluten.
It can be one of the triggers, but you're never going to know if it's a trigger until you sit down with a dietitian or
Right.
nutritionist and work through it. The IBS is not solely diet, the majority of it is to do with lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
So, about 1 in 5 suffer from IBS. Now, in terms of gluten intolerance, there's two statistics I know off the top of my head. One is to do with America, and the other is to do with the UK. So, in America, 80% of people are on a gluten-free diet. Uh,
80%, like 80.
80% of people are on a gluten-free diet that do not have celiac disease. So that's one
They
statistic.
have gluten intolerance and allergies, or just,
No, they just self-identify as a gluten-free diet,
wow,
regardless.
that's huge. So, according to
That's
that,
huge.
everywhere in the US should be serving gluten-free stuff.
Yeah, but they're not great as a
Yeah, I
country.
was gonna say.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is in the UK they did a study where they asked people to self-report on intolerances, and 20% claimed they had an allergy or intolerance to food. But when you broke that down and looked at whether that was medically diagnosed or not,
Yeah.
it was only 1.8% that actually had a diagnosable intolerance.
Wow. But
So yeah.
I think also a huge factor is a lot of these intolerance tests require people to eat gluten or whatever it is that they're being tested on. So I know, like, a few years ago, like many years ago, I used to eat lobster, and whenever I ate lobster, my throat would itch, my stomach would be a total hazard for 2 days. All the symptoms you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And that's when I decided I don't want to eat this anymore. And I got to know how they cook it and prepare it. And I was like, yeah, no, not touching lobsters anymore. But the problem is, like when I did an intolerance test, it came back saying I am perfectly fine with lobsters. And I was like, okay, I paid 200 pounds for this. I know I'm not fine with lobsters. What's going on? And then their
Yeah.
response was, did you eat lobsters in the last 3 months? How many times did you eat lobsters? And I said, not at all, because it almost killed me every time I ate it. And the guys from the from the testing side were like, well, how do we know you're intolerant to it if you don't eat it? And I was thinking, do you guys ask someone with a peanut allergy to eat peanuts so it shows in your test, or how does it work?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, those intolerance tests have to be done in a really controlled environment.
Mm,
So there's different types, and certainly the gold standard still in the UK for intolerance testing is the trial elimination diet followed by reintroduction, and it is still
right,
the gold standard and still the one that all dietitians, GPs, and nutritionists work by because it's the only one where we know we will have direct scientific results.
right.
Um, so
And sometimes that helps the body also like readjust or reprogram itself. So for example,
exactly.
I know at one point I couldn't eat tomatoes. I was eating a lot of tomatoes. I love tomatoes. I was getting rash and everything to it, and I was told you're intolerant to tomatoes. I stopped it for a few months, went back to it, did the same test, everything was fine.
Yeah. It's confusing. And as I said, there's just not enough research there. And so what we have to go by is just the gold standards that are available for nutritional
Mm,
professionals based on the NICE guidelines. And what they are is how you know you will have an intolerance is having that medically diagnosed by a GP or a dietitian through your trial
mhm.
elimination diet.
Okay. And in the UK, so the US was 80%, of which 1.8 only were actually medically required to do that. What about the UK stats?
Oh, so yeah, the UK was basically they asked people to self-report if they had any food allergies, and 20% of the people within this survey claimed that they had an intolerance or an allergy. But when you then broke that down and looked at if that was medically diagnosed by a GP or a dietitian, it was only 1.8% who
Oh, so that
actually
was the UK, the
eventually.
1.8. Right.
So the other people were self-diagnosers and hadn't had it medically diagnosed. So
Okay.
in terms of the amount of people that have gluten intolerance, I'm not entirely sure because that exact issue comes to play where people
Yeah.
self-diagnose themselves without having it medically diagnosed. So you're never going to get accurate figures on that.
Yeah, yeah, I can guess. And you'll never get accurate figures because let's face it, if someone like me is avoiding gluten anyway, good luck testing it and knowing that I'm intolerant to it.
Yeah, yeah. So you're never going to get reliable figures on it. For
Yeah.
celiac, you are.
Awesome. Well, I didn't receive any other questions. Let me check my phone as well. Yeah, no other questions. So I guess everybody's happy and satisfied with all the questions. Orla, I can't thank you enough for the great knowledge you shared with us,
No
for all the
problem.
questions you answered, whether you knew they were being asked or whether they just came suddenly at you, or any other pieces
We
of
thought
knowledge you shared.
so.
We really enjoyed having you on this call and this talk. Guys, highly recommend you follow Orla on Instagram. We fell in love with all the things she was posting. She doesn't post as much as we do, so you're not gonna get as spammed as much. But she posts really useful information. And not only is she a nutritionist, but she actually has lived with celiac disease, so she actually knows what it involves, the emotional side, the physical side, the nutritional side, everything. So do follow her. Easiest way to find her, just look up celiac nutritionist or just look up our followers and the people we're following, and you're gonna find her there. um, we're really thankful for having you, Orla. Maybe we'll have another one like this in a few weeks' time when we have more questions coming up. And over to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me on. It's an absolute passion of mine. Love talking about celiac disease, gluten-free, and gut health as well. So it's been really great for me to answer questions that people aren't sure of and to share my knowledge.
And us as well. And by the way, we just got 3 comments saying thank you, great talk, very informative. And one of them said she will see you at the free from aisle. I think this one is joking. Or was like,
Very
no.
good. Very good. I love it. I love it. You will sometimes see me at the free from ad, don't get me wrong.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Orla.
No problem.
And